Hello everyone. I'm here to talk about my Tableau project. Hello everyone. I'm here to talk about my Tableau project, which is concerned with containing the spread of the influenza virus in the US in 2018, based on historical data. We are now in 2024. Nevertheless, the project is an attempt to recognize the pattern of the virus spread and dispatch medical staff accordingly. This virus had claimed about 38,000 lives in 2017 and approximately 22,000 lives in 2016, making this a concern for the nation's health infrastructure. Since our agency itself is short-staffed, we have to work in limited numbers and plan accordingly. This project is a preliminary step and it attempts to mobilize staff to 9 geographic regions, which will be detailed in the next slide. The scope of this project is limited to these 9 regions, and the idea is to further break down each of these 9 groups to subgroups at a later stage and possibly with the help of more data. Working with limited staff, our strategy is to focus on the vulnerable population. But what do we mean by vulnerable population? Vulnerable population is defined as people who are aged 65 and above. It means this pie chart here and the tree map here will give you an overall idea of how poorly affected these people are. The small segment is accounts for the death among people who are below 65 years, and this larger segment, which is blue in color, represents the vulnerable population. Here, this tree map represents all the states of the US, and you can see California is doing really poorly with almost 50K deaths in 2017. New York, Texas, Pennsylvania are not far behind. Now, moving on to factors which affect the spread of this virus. Firstly, we will look into the relationship, if any, weather has with the virus spread. We perform an analysis by month, and this is what the column chart represents. If we take a closer look, we can see that indeed in the winter months, January, February, March, and December, the mortality rate appears higher compared to the fall and summer seasons. During the pre-winter months, October and November, the virus starts to increase in intensity, and this looks like an ideal time to start with the vaccinations, as the vaccine itself will take approximately 2 weeks to kick in and start becoming effective. The midweeks of November would not be a poor choice to do so. Now let's take a look at the population of the census of the vulnerable population and the death count. The donut chart on the left represents the population of the 64 plus year olds in the US states. You can see that states like California, Texas, New York, and Florida all have a high count of aging population. If you remember the tree map from the first slide, these were also the states that showed alarming death toll numbers. So the bar graph on the right should not be very surprising. But here we made another distinction based on the saturation color of the bars. So here you can see California, uh, which uh, which has the most number of deaths above 64 in the vulnerable population segment, and uh, and within the vulnerable population segment, we could start with the more elderly. By more elderly, I mean people who are aged above 85 years. As it would be wise to prioritize vaccinating people based on age. Now moving on. Here we have a geographic representation of the 9 regions, which was briefly mentioned in the introduction slide. So these are the 9 regions. This text uh, details the regions and the states which make up each of these regions. So for Mid-Atlantic, we have the states of New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. For East, North, Central, we have Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and so on and so forth. So here The more saturated or darker the shade of the state, the higher the death toll. So the west, south, central region, where Texas is, and the western regions like the Pacific region, which comprises of California and states New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, make up the Middle Atlantic. One interesting thing to notice here is that the virus spread seems to be concentrated in the western and eastern coast of the US, while the central regions seem to be doing fairly better. This could be due to various reasons, possibly because they are less densely populated, given the rocky landscape of states like West Virginia. Unfortunately, our data set is limited in its scope and, as such, doesn't provide much information on population density or the population spread. However, this project could get even more exciting if we could factor in such variables and establish correlation and test this hypothesis. The bubble chart on the right captures the positive correlation between the population count and the death toll in the 64 plus year olds. And we can see that the same states like California, New York, Florida, and Texas doing rather poorly. Now, we have come to the conclusion of this presentation, and here we will address the objective of this project, forecasting the spread in 2018. We can see that out of the nine regions are doing very poorly: South Atlantic, Middle Atlantic, East North Central, and the Pacific. Reiterating the previous observation, the coastal regions of the US are more vulnerable. Dispatching staff accordingly may help contain the spread. As a next step, we can think of focusing on specific states and cities and subgrouping these nine original groups further down based on the mortality rate. For instance, the group dispatched to the Middle Atlantic could be divided and a higher priority given to New York and Pennsylvania than to states like New Jersey, which are less impacted. Similarly, California should be the focal point in the Pacific region, as the other states in the Pacific region, like Alaska and Oregon, record very low numbers. Keeping these in mind, the staffing agency could be dispatched accordingly. It is also essential to define metrics to track the progress of this plan of action. Since the vulnerable population is the focus of this project, we need to monitor the death rate after the vaccinations have been given. Another metric we can use to monitor the progress is the rate at which these vaccinations are given. This can be monitored in terms of the average number of weeks it takes to vaccinate 10,000 vulnerable citizens. Thank you for listening.